Good evening, everyone. It is good to see all of you out tonight. It's great to be out tonight together with you to worship God and to study His Word here in our midweek Bible study. So thankful that you are here. We are in the second half of Okay, there?
Yeah.
Okay. I won't repeat all that. We're in Acts chapters 23 and 24, and we're covering these four categories, and we'll begin. How your servant Paul used himself in your service to bring glory and honor to your name, and to see the things that we can learn from him about how we can be the same kind of servants, if not in the same way, but at least in similar way that brings glory and honor to your name in everything that we do. We thank you for your Son and the sacrifice he made for us and the life that he gives us of eternal life with you. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right. Things working out? All right, let's try that again. All right, then we'll move back around here again. This is musical stands tonight. All right, let's look at the first question. What counsel in Acts chapter 23 was Paul addressing? What counsel? In verse 21 of chapter 23, he says, Paul, looking intently at the council. What council is he talking about? Anybody? You can shout this now. It's one word. All right, the Sanhedrin. That's right, Matt. It's the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin is a group of 71 members from the various groups that there in Judea, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They were the leaders of the group. Now, the word Sanhedrin, I think sometimes because of our use of it from the Bible and our recognition of it from the Bible, we might think that it's a particularly Jewish concept, but actually it's not. The name Sanhedrin did not originate from Judaism. It's a Greek word that literally means the idea of sun, or which is with, or together, and hedros, which is to sit or convene. So it's a Greek word. And it's the idea of a council of people and that would sit together to rule over a city or a country or some area there in Greece. And that's where it originated. It was just a form of government, a ruling body. It was adopted by the Romans, who adopted pretty much anything Greek that they could get their hands on and their mind around. And then was adopted, passed on down to some other people. It's in the U.S. Congress, where the idea of the U.S. Congress kind of is based on this idea of a ruling council or a ruling group of people who would sit and rule over, provide government over people. Now, in the Jewish setting there that Paul was addressing, it was a council of 71 men, and it had developed with their exposure to Greek culture about 200 years earlier, before Christ had come, and it grew in significance, but they had 70 and plus one. They had 71 people on this council. Now, that 71, or that number, had a very specific Jewish heritage to it. Anybody know what that might be? I go all the way back to the Exodus, when Moses is fed up with the people, fed up with their complaining. God is fed up with their complaining. Moses complains to God and says, why are you doing this to me, making me responsible for all these people? And God tells him to do what? Does anybody remember? That's not in the... there we go. Anybody remember the text? Okay, look, if you will, in Numbers chapter 11. Let's look at Numbers chapter 11. Just look at this very briefly. And won't read all of the text there because it has a lot of extra information. I just want to draw out of it the number here that where God told Moses to pick 70 men to help him rule. Numbers chapter 11. And in beginning in verse 10, the whole thing starts in verse 10 when Moses heard the people weeping and throughout their families, each man at the doorway of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly, and Moses was displeased. And so Moses was very bold. Just kind of an interesting thing here. Moses was bold. Moses said to the Lord, why have you been so hard on your servant? In other words, why did you do this to me? And why have I not found favor in your sight that you have laid the burden of all this people on me? I mean, he goes on to say, you expect me to carry them like a nursing mother, in verse 12, carries a nursing infant? What am I going to do? And so then God tells him, look ahead a few verses. In verse 16, the Lord therefore said to Moses, gather for me 70 men from the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people. And so they picked out 70 men to help him lead the nation. And so when this Sanhedrin idea came about, and with their exposure to Greek culture, they then they set up this Sanhedrin, or this group of 70 men sitting together, and the tiebreaker, in case there was a tie, would be the high priest, who would be kind of like the Moses or the Aaron of this group. And so these were the guys that Paul was addressing. This is where that group came from. It was not something that was particularly carried over in the law, but it was just something that God gave Moses at the time of his leading the people and needing some help with the people in the nation of Israel. Now, the high priest and these people were supposed to be men of high character, high quality men. Men like elders that are selected to serve as elders of a local congregation. They're men, and in Numbers, or Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 19, it says they must not pervert justice, they must not show favoritism, and they must not accept bribes. That's the kind of men that were supposed to be on this council. But the very high priest, the man sitting as the leader of this council, was exactly the kind of man who perverted justice, accepted bribes, and showed favoritism. He was an evil, wicked man, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the whole council was filled with a lot of men who were like that. And the worst one, possibly the whole group, was the high priest. And so when Paul begins addressing them, he begins his address there. We'll flip back to Acts chapter 23. Go back to Acts 23. So Paul begins, he says to the council, brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. We'll talk about that later, but I want us to just kind of notice, how does this high priest, this corrupt, vile man who is leading the council, how does he react to Paul's statement? How does he react to it? All right, that's right. Dale, he had him smacked in the face. In fact, notice in verse 2, the high priest, Ananias, not the same one that was during the time of Jesus, that was Annas, a different man. commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth or smack him in the face, punch him in the mouth. Now, is that a good way to respond, a good way to react, or a bad way? Exactly. It's a bad way. It's a bad way to react. It was an indication of the kind of character that this man had. He had no business being in this position, but it was one that he had actually purchased through favoritism, showing favoritism to the Romans, and got into his position that way. He didn't like what Paul had. He didn't even like where Paul was going. He wasn't even going to let him finish his opening statement. Wasn't going to let him say anything. The minute he said this about him, his conscience being clear in what he had been doing, the high priest said, we got to stop this. I'm not going to put up with this. I'm not going to tolerate this. And he ordered someone to slap him in the face. Now, here's the next part of that question. Was it legal? All right, see, Shannon shaking his head no. Anybody else? All right. Not according to what Paul said. Now, Paul doesn't cite a specific passage, or if he does, it's not referenced. But in verse 3, he says something. We'll talk about his response in just a moment. But he does add this. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law, order me to be struck? Right. So what Paul's saying is, you're sitting here trying to judge me according to the law, but right off the bat, you break the law. You did something that it was illegal for you to do. You had no right to do that. It was absolutely illegal. And look at Leviticus chapter 19. Hold your Bible and marker in Acts 23, but turn back to Leviticus 19. And we'll also look at another passage in Deuteronomy, in Leviticus 19. Just that passage describing how judges, and that's what this man is sitting as, a judge, how they are to act. Acts chapter 19, verse 35. You shall do no wrong in judgment. That's just a basic principle. The interesting thing from this is we're going to see that there are inferences here that have to be drawn, necessary inferences that have to be drawn by the people that are reading this. But he says, you shall do no wrong in judgment. Well, how do we know it's wrong to order him to smack somebody? Well, let's turn to another passage. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 25. Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verses 1 and 2. And in that passage, there is a list of things to do when a case is brought for trial. Verse 1, he says, if there is a dispute between men, and they go to court, and the judges decide their case, and they justify the righteous and condemn the wicked, then it shall be, if the wicked man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall then make him lie down and be beaten in his presence with the number of stripes according to his guilt. So when can a judge order a man to be beaten?
After judgment has been passed.
All right, Matt is right. Matt, after judgment has been passed, and what else has to be the part of this as well? It has to be a case that deserves beating. It may not be a case that deserves beating. But in this case, the high priest just bypassed all that, made an illegal order. And in fact, what every one of those people in there, all 70 of the other men in there, or however many were there, should have said, turned and looked at him and said, no, we're not going to do that. You don't have the right to make us do that. It's kind of like in the military. In the military, you're supposed to obey your commanders, obey those above you, but there's also a principle that if they issue an illegal order or make an illegal demand, that you're bound by a higher law not to obey. And so that was something that was just shows the kind of character that this man had, that he didn't care about the law. He cared about exercising his power and his authority over men. And that's why those kind of people should not be in those kind of positions. Now let's go back to chapter 23 and let's look at what Paul does in response. And there are several lessons in here. We'll get into it in more detail on Sunday when we talk about the growing church and that last question in the sheet, a set of questions that I sent out. But when Paul responds to this, the high priest said, smack him in the mouth, Paul said, God's going to smack you in the mouth. That's exactly it's the same word. Strike and strike. Smack, smack. You smack me in the mouth, God's going to smack you in the mouth. Now, Paul did that. And that's the question, was it a good thing to do? All right, let's all be honest. Just be honest. How many of you say, yes, yeah, you tell him, Paul? Are you saying yeah? Okay. But was it the right thing to do? No. Even if the man deserved it, it was not the right thing to do. Even if the man deserved it, he said, God will punch you in the mouth, you hypocrite. It wasn't legal because it was a violation of the law. Paul can't, because you get into a circle here of, well, how dare you judge me, who are sitting here to judge me under the law, break the law, so therefore it's okay if I break the law too in response. Is that how it works? No. Paul had to respect that office and that position, even if it was the wrong thing to do. In fact, notice how all of a sudden the bystanders were okay with him ordering them to somebody to smack Paul in the mouth. It's okay if you break the law here. But oh, no, wait a minute. Now you're attacking my sacred cow, the high priest. How dare you do that? You see the hypocrisy here. This is why Christians have no business doing this on either side. They have no business acting as dictators, and they have no business as attacking them in vile, ungodly ways. We can't be wrong. We have to not be a part of either one of these things. Paul's response was illegal, even if the citation was true. In Exodus 22, verse 28, Paul quotes it, where he says, "You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." That's pretty clear law, isn't it? So, if you disagree with the elder's statement, something the elders say or do, you go back and say, those elders, oh, not cuss words, but disparaging words. Mike preaches a sermon you don't like? I can't believe he said that. That McClenny guy says something in Bible class, and you can rip him to shreds all you want, go right ahead. But you see what I mean? You got to be very careful here. And it's the same thing with politics. Anybody ever said about president or our current governor or the previous governor something untoward and unflattering and nasty? Yeah, we have. I'm guilty. And then I'll catch myself and say, wait a minute, no, I can't do that. Can't do that. We have to be the kind of people that do not speak evil of our leaders. We just can't do that. And we have to be very, very careful. That doesn't mean we can't disagree, but when we disagree, we better do it respectfully and forthrightly. Never by tearing them down and speaking evil of them. So Paul blew it there. He blew it. He just flat blew it here. And he admitted it. We don't know if he actually went on and say, well, I'm sorry, but he stated very clearly here, I was not aware that he was a high priest, and then quoted the law that condemned what he had just done. That's pretty close to an apology, even if it wasn't spelled out fully. All right, good comment?
I think it's interesting in John, the 18th chapter, in verse 22, when Jesus was struck by one of them that stood by, and he was basically being judged for answering the high priest in the way that he did. And Jesus came back with a defense saying, if I'm guilty, then show the evidence. Bring the witnesses on. And so what Paul was experiencing was not more than what Jesus had experienced. And he was on the other side.
Yeah, the microphone went out about halfway through that, but you're right. So when Jesus was going through the same situation, Carol, you're right. He responded and he answered the question, but it was not in a disrespectful way. Paul was being disrespectful. And so when Jesus was presented with that, and the same thing, smack him, that somebody just hauled off and hit him, and he said, I just answered the question. He was not being disrespectful. Well, Paul was. And so, we don't want to try to kind of cover over this and act as if Paul couldn't do anything wrong. He's a human being. And so he didn't do this, and he did something else in this that he later admits was not right. We'll talk about it in just a moment. So Paul was very upset about this, reacted angrily. And it's interesting, though, he said, God is going to strike you. And this exact same word, he said, strike him. And Paul responded, God's going to strike you. And then he called him a hypocrite, you whitewashed wall. And then when it's pointed out he was a high priest, he quoted the law that condemned himself for what he had done. And it's interesting, though, and reading all the different commentaries and discussions about this passage, a lot of people want to defend it and say it was the right thing to do because it turned out to be prophetic in a sense. Because God did strike this man dead, because this man was so vile. And in 66 A.D., at the beginning of the rebellion, the Jewish rebellion that led ultimately to the destruction of Jerusalem, this high priest had to flee from his own people, from Jewish assassins, and ended up hiding in a sewer, trying to get away, and was found and drug out and killed. Murdered by fellow Jews who wanted to rebel against the Romans because he had embedded himself too closely with the Roman people. So in a sense it was fulfilled, but Paul spoke in a way that he should not have. Questions, thoughts, comments? Anybody else? If we can get a microphone that works. We're having fun tonight with that. This is fun with batteries tonight. All right, let's go to the next question. How did Paul disrupt the hearing? Chapter 23, verses 6 through 9.
He turned them against each other.
All right, Matt's right. He turned them against each other. Dale, you were going to say something? Oh, hang on. He's coming. Matt can be my official shouter.
He knew he had Pharisees and Sadducees both there, so he spoke up, I'm a Pharisee, and that got it going.
All right, very good. Exactly. That's exactly what he did. He spotted that there was a division between the two, between the halves of the group, and he turned them on each other by shouting out that I'm a Pharisee. And he pointed out that he, as a Pharisee, he was a person who believed in spirit beings and angels and in the resurrection, which is something the Pharisees believed in. And in fact, it caused such a disruption in the group that they began fighting each other. The Sadducees don't believe in any of that. They're modern materialists. If it's not matter, that's something you can touch or see or put under a microscope, it doesn't exist. The spirit world really doesn't exist. And that's a whole different discussion, and I don't want to launch into it. And so Paul divides them and gets them to fighting. And it was such a sharp division within the group that the Pharisees basically took Paul's side. And at one point here, after he insulted the high priest, he was looking at it, he was in trouble because now they were all aligned against him. And so now he's divided them, and they're fighting each other, and they were even saying, well, maybe he did see a spirit, because you've got to remember, what had he said earlier in the temple, that what had appeared to him, that the Lord had appeared to him. And so they weren't going to admit that Jesus of Nazareth was that Lord who appeared to him, but they were going to say, well, maybe a spirit did appear to him, or an angel appeared to him. And so they were taking a side, and what happened as a result of this? That's his comment. What happened as a result? They basically were trying to tear him apart. We'll get to that in a moment. Now, what was his comment on his disruption of the hearing? This is my second point about how he did something he really shouldn't have done, even though it served a purpose for him. It saved him from the united front that they were about to show him. What did he say about it in chapter 24? Let's look over in chapter 24. In verses 20 and 21. He admits, now I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. In verse 20 and 21 it says, and he's defending himself and talking about these Jews from Asia who ought to have been present before you and to make accusation if they should have anything against me, or else let these men themselves, tell what misdeed they found when I stood before the council. So he said, let them point out a misdeed. So he uses the word misdeed. And then he goes on in verse 21, other than for this one statement. So he says misdeed, and then he applies that word misdeed to what he did in this council. When I shouted out while standing among them for the resurrection of the dead, I am on trial before you today. So what he said was true. That's why he was on trial. But he used it to disrupt this hearing, and it calls it a misdeed. Some of the other versions, NIV calls it a crime. New King James Version calls it wrongdoing. King James Version calls it evildoing. It's the word for unrighteousness. It was an unrighteous act. So Paul's admitting he shouldn't have done this. And I'm pointing this out for us so that we can understand Paul is human just like us and needs sometimes to be rebuked. So just wanted any thoughts, comments on that? Are y'all looking at me like, no, you don't agree with me? This may be shaking some of you a little bit. It's there. It's in the text. That's what Paul says about it. Paul's own commentary. So I think it was important for us to notice this. All right. Let's go to the next question. Who rescued Paul again? Remember, he got rescued in the temple when the Jews were about to kill him. And then after he finished speaking and he got to the word Gentiles, and they wanted to try to kill him again, who rescued him? All right, the Roman commander. The commander, Matt, right, is the commander of the Roman garrison there that is in Jerusalem, especially during this time of the Pentecost, this time of the feast, when there was a more likely possibility of unrest. And so he had to rescue him again. Because notice what it says in chapter 23. Go back to chapter 23. Verse 10. It said, as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces. Afraid Paul would be torn to pieces. So they were in there. Paul was the chicken bone. He was the wishbone between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they were yanking him this way and that. And he thought he was going to be killed, literally torn apart by this mob. So he steps in there and has to save him again. And think about this. This is the Sanhedrin. This is the ruling council of the Jewish nation, the people who represent God. The high priest is God's mediator on earth. He's supposed to be representing the people of God to God and God to the people of God, and showing to the nations around how God acts and how God's people act. And who has to step in and separate these two people, these two groups going after it? A pagan Roman. A pagan Roman. Doesn't say much about their character, does it? Anybody ever been in a deacon's meeting, elders deacon, or a men's business meeting where it got ugly? Yeah, they happen. And it's disgraceful. It's just disgraceful and unacceptable that kind of behavior would go on and be conducted by people who claim to be followers of God. And so this man who is a pagan, doesn't believe in God at all, has to step in and show people how they ought to act. All right. So that was the Roman commander. So who rescued Paul? Who appeared to Paul again in verse 11 of chapter 23? That's one word. You shout it out.
The Lord.
All right, the Lord. All right, that's two words, but that's the Lord. Jesus did. The Lord came, as Dale pointed out. The Lord came to Paul and spoke to him in verse 11. But on that night, so he was arrested, rescued. The next morning they had his opportunity to speak to this hearing or have this hearing. It blew up. That night, immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, take courage. We'll talk about the other part of that later, but right now he just says, take courage. Why do you think he appeared to Paul and said, take courage? Let me ask you as an elder, do you ever get down? Do you ever get worried, frustrated, and fearful, concerned?
Well, I've made this statement a number of times, and I can talk loud enough without the thing. You know, desire is the first thing they say about being an elder.
Yeah.
But there are times, I mean, the desire has to leave for a little while and then come back because of some of the things. Yeah.
All right. Johnny is saying that the desire, that one of the requirements for being an elder is the desire to serve in that capacity. But sometimes that desire gets weak and has to kind of step aside for a little while, but then come back. And having served as an elder, yes, I know exactly what you mean. And so it's something that has caused them to be, the only word I can think of is just down. There may be a more clinical word would be depressed, just completely at a loss. Think about it. He knew that he was going to be arrested. He knew that things were going to go bad. He was going to be delivered to the Gentiles, but there was no indication. There was nothing else told him, or at least told us that was told him, about how it would unfold. And so maybe he thought that being arrested would give him an opportunity then to speak to his people, speak to the Jewish people, and successfully win souls to the Lord. And what does he get? He gets beaten almost to death in the temple, rescued by pagan Romans, gets almost torn apart by the leading council of the nation of Israel. And so he's got to be in that jail cell that night, just, I don't know, Lord. Why? Why? What am I doing this for? Why am I here? I'm an utter and complete failure. Now, and I'm saying that because, again, we need to see the human side of Paul here. He needed the Lord to come to him and say, take courage. Take courage. You can get through this. Are we at a difficult time here in our time in life right now? I can't see what you're saying because you're all wearing masks. Oh, wait a minute. That kind of gives it away, doesn't it? Yeah. Anita. All right. And so as he comes down here, we got these difficulties. We need to be encouraged. We need to be lifted up. And the Lord's not going to come to us like he did to Paul, but he's doing it through Paul here to take courage.
As of this past October, I've been an elder for 26 years. And since March, this has been one of the hardest challenges as an elder I've had to deal with. You've got people who believe strongly in the mask. You've got people that say, I don't want to wear a mask and I won't wear a mask. You got people that are scared to death of this virus. And this has been my statement on it. I'm not scared of it because if I die at 12 o'clock Sunday morning, I want to be able to say I was at church the hour before I died. And that's, I know everybody looks at it a little different, but that's the way an old 73-year-old man looks at it.
Do you feel like that wishbone, like Paul was?
And I respect everybody else's feelings on it, but you know,
it's exhausting. It's exhausting. Thank you. I appreciate that. And that's exactly the point here, is that Paul needed encouragement. So the elders need encouragement. All of us need encouragement to know that we can get through this because we have the Lord on our side. Now, we'll talk more on Sunday when we get to the question about providence, that sometimes that providence may not be what we want it to be. It may be, as Johnny said, you walk out of the building and you die. That's Sunday's class. Come back to that. That'll be exciting. And that should just make you want to be here Sunday morning. James says I can come to church and then I might walk out and die. So that's a challenge to prove me wrong. LR wants to say something.
When I read this about Paul, I think about the book of Joshua there in the first chapter.
Joshua's picking up the mantle, so to speak, of Moses, leading these people. And he's told, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and of good courage, for to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore their fathers to give them. We see this is a theme, not just one time. We see God giving his people this advice. Be strong, be of good courage.
Take courage. Leaders have to take courage and be encouraged. And the sheep, the followers, need to be the ones encouraging, lifting up and elevating.
I think God has this in his word, so we can be strong and of good courage, is to encourage us as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not just the leaders. All right, thank you. All right, I've got 7 more pages to go through. No, just keep, actually just 6. All right, what plot was concocted and who all was involved? So after this failure and Paul's in the jail cell that night and the Lord appears to him and says, take courage. He says more to him and we'll talk about that on Sunday. But he says, take courage. What does the Lord know that Paul doesn't know yet? There are a group of men who are going to try to kill him. So there's a conspiracy to kill Paul that's developed. Over 40 men, and who do they involve in their plot to kill Paul? All right, as Matt said, the high priest and the elders. So this council, at least some part of the council, if not the whole council, is involved in this plot because these men who are going to kill Paul, 40 of them, because you got to remember there's a large group of soldiers there. Paul's going to be guarded closely, and so they're basically going to attack a Roman garrison, a group of Roman soldiers, so that they can get to Paul. And they want to have enough men to do it so that if at least one can get through and succeed. And so they're going to get they involve the Sanhedrin. How did they involve the Sanhedrin? The leadership council? They asked them to call for a meeting with Paul. They said, all right, what we want you to do. So the next day they made a plot. What we want you to do is go to the commander and ask the commander to come bring Paul down so we can examine him again. All as a ruse to get him exposed so they can kill him. And so they were going to do it. They were going to go along with it. So that's what they did. That's why I asked the question, what 3 of the 10 commandments were violated by this? 2 of them you probably know off the top of your head. One of them you may be wondering where I'm going with it. But the first one is the second commandment, or the third commandment actually, thou do not take the Lord's name in vain. I think sometimes we have trivialized this commandment. Because it's if somebody types OMG, our head explodes because they've taken the Lord's name in vain. And they have, and I don't want to belittle that or diminish that. But this command is far more serious than just that. This is the idea of using God's name to support yourself in doing something evil. That's what they were doing. They were going to do something evil, but they swore an oath to God that God would strike them down if they didn't carry out this evil deed. So they were attaching God to an evil act. Think about that. Let that percolate a little bit. When we teach false doctrine and claim in the name of God that XYZ is true when XYZ is not true, we're taking the Lord's name in vain because we're attaching his name to something that's false. All right? Do not take, that's one. That was the first one, because they swore the oath. The second one is, do not commit murder. What did they swear an oath to do? Commit murder. Third one was, do not bear false witness. What was the Sanhedrin going to do when they went to the commander? Lie through their teeth. Bear false witness. They were going to get him down there on a false pretense. So I thought it was important to kind of see how this was unfolding, that these were ungodly men. And not surprisingly, within just about another decade or so, most of them were going to be killed, if not all of them. All right, next question. Who discovered the plot and what did he do with the information? All right, Matt, Paul's nephew. Paul's nephew. How many of you knew Paul had a nephew until this verse? Nobody. In fact, that's the bonus question. All right, Paul's nephew. Bonus question. All right, well, they asked what did he do? He brought it to Paul, and then Paul sent him to the commander. He brought it to the commander. Here's a bonus question. What do we know about Paul's family? All right, well, before we found out about the sister, what did we find out about, Matt? No, well, we found out that his dad was a Pharisee. All right, go back to 23 when he says in verse 6, I am a Pharisee, a son of a Pharisee. So we know his dad was a Pharisee. That's the first thing we know about him. We know he had a sister who had a son and lived in Jerusalem. And Romans tells us that he has 5 men and a woman that are his kinsmen, which the way the passage reads appears to refer to blood relatives. Other than that, what do we know? That's it. That's it. Paul's family just is not discussed other than this. But his nephew finds out about it, comes to him, and reveals this to him. And as a result, he takes it to the commander, and the commander finds out. All right, let's hurry through this next section here. So Felix's reaction. What's Felix's reaction? Claudius Lysias, the commander. All right, he protected the boy, took him aside privately and asked him to get the information, then told him, don't tell anybody about this. Because what did he know could happen to that boy if he let it know that he revealed this? You got 40 men plus and the Sanhedrin willing to kill Paul. What do you think they're going to do to a boy if they find out he spoiled their plot? They kill him too. That's the kind of people you're talking about. So then he protected Paul. He sent him to Caesarea. There's a drone shot of the city of Caesarea 2,000 years ago. You didn't know they had drones back then, did you? All right, so anyway, that's an artistic rendering of what the city would be like. Caesarea, it's a port city. It was a well-known, it was a Roman city, and it was pretty much a pagan city. And that's where, remember, Paul was just 2 weeks earlier with Philip the evangelist and the 4 daughters that were prophetesses, as well as the church there. And so that's where he went. He sent him there safely with an escort of 470 soldiers, 200 horsemen, 200 soldiers, and 70 spearmen. Claudius Lysias took his job of protecting Roman citizens very seriously, didn't he? He took it, so we might say that's a little bit overkill. Is that a bad pun? That's a little bit too much, but no. If you got 40 men that are willing to sacrifice, risk themselves to kill him, he's got to protect him. He's going to make sure that he's kept safely. So he sent him there. Sent him when he gets there. Felix is the governor at the time. He gets the governor, and his reaction. It's actually very benign. There doesn't seem to be a shock on his part. And we find out why, because in the next few questions, he treated him with respect. He agreed to hear his case and put him up in the palace. So he went from being in the jail, afraid for his life, and fleeing all night long, afraid for his life, to being put up in the palace. That's not bad. And he stays there for the next 2 years. All right. The Jews' argument to Felix when they came down in chapter 24 was, we don't like him, we want to kill him. That's pretty much it. That's my version of it. But that's pretty much, they were ready to kill him. And the second thing is, what was Paul's defense? How did Paul defend himself? He said, I didn't do what they say. They don't have any evidence. They have no evidence. He asked for them to bring evidence. And that's where he says, the only thing I did that you might call a wicked deed was when I yelled out and caused the division. But these guys, other than that, nothing. They got nothing. In fact, he said there were some Asian Jews who actually started the riot in the temple. They, under the law, they needed to be there making the case. But they weren't there. They weren't there at all. And so he said, the third thing is, he said, I believe God's promises. That's what he believed. And so he was going to stand with it. That's why he's under trial. Because he believed the promises of God, and the Jews did not. All right? So that was his defense. A couple of the last things here. What advantage did Felix have that favored Paul? What did Felix know better than even the Jews who lived in Jerusalem? And certainly better than Claudius Lysias, the commander. He knew more about the way of Christ. He had a greater knowledge about that. And it's possibly because his wife was from Herod's family. She was a Jew from the family of Herod. So it might be that that's where he had more information. But he had been a ruler there for long enough that he knew what was going on. Even if he was a vile, wicked man, and he was, he had his thumb on the pulse, finger on the pulse. He knew what was going on in Jerusalem and in Judea, and so he was prepared for it. But there was a disadvantage. What was the disadvantage? All right, since this is my gratuitous political shot, he was a greedy politician. He wanted money. And he kept Paul in jail for 2 years when he should have been released. All right, we'll pick up with the question on preaching the gospel next Sunday.